The richest man in the room was the one carrying dirty plates, and the only woman who noticed asked him 3 words that stopped his heart. Friday night at Halston table moved like a machine polished to a shine so expensive it almost looked cold. All crystal glasses, low amber light, and steaks leaving the kitchen on white porcelain plates that cost more than most people's weekly groceries. In the middle of it all, Ethan Cole kept his head down and wore a black waiter's vest with someone else's name pinned to it, balancing a tray on one hand while a table of investors laughed too loudly over a bottle of Napa Red. No one at those tables knew the man refilling their water owned every inch of the restaurant, from the marble bar to the last fork in the dish pit. That was the point. Ethan had spent the last 2 weeks working the floor like any other employee, listening, watching, taking notes in his head, while managers smiled upward and barked downward. Then a customer turned too fast, a glass tipped, and red wine ran down Ethan's white shirt in a stain as dark as bruised cherries. Before he could even reach for a towel, Vanessa, the floor manager, was already at his shoulder with that sharp little smile she used when she wanted someone smaller than her to feel it. "Clean it up," she snapped under her breath. Then louder, for the table, "I'm so sorry, he's new." Ethan nodded, because that was the role, and because sometimes the easiest way to learn the truth about a place was to let it embarrass you. He disappeared into the narrow pantry behind the kitchen, where the music from the dining room dulled to a faraway hum and the smell of butter, garlic, and hot bread clung to the walls. He set the tray down, pressed both hands to the metal shelf, and closed his eyes for 1 second longer than he meant to. He had skipped dinner again. He had skipped sleep, too. It was amazing, he thought, how easy it was to build something beautiful and still fail the people holding it together. The pantry door eased open. Ethan straightened fast, but it was only Clare Bennett, one of the evening waitresses, her blonde hair twisted into a loose bun that never stayed neat past 8 p.m. Her apron pocket stuffed with order pads and pens. She took one look at the wine on his shirt, then at the way he was standing like the room had gotten smaller around him. Without saying a word, she reached into the warmer, pulled out a covered plate meant for staff meal, and slid it toward him with half a roll wrapped in a clean napkin. Then, in the gentlest voice he had heard in years, she asked, "Have you eaten?" Ethan froze. Because 15 years earlier, in a kitchen no bigger than this pantry, with rent overdue and rain tapping the old window, his mother had turned from the stove, smiled through her own exhaustion, and asked him those exact 3 words. Ethan did not touch the plate for a second, just stared at Clare as if the air between them had turned solid. She noticed it, of course, but instead of asking why, she gave him the kind of small, practical shrug people learn after life has disappointed them enough times. "Then eat before Vanessa sees it and decides kindness is against company policy," she said softly, already turning back toward the swinging kitchen door. Ethan looked down at the food again, roasted chicken, mashed potatoes, green beans glazed with butter, nothing fancy compared to the 28-ounce dry-aged ribeyes leaving the line, and somehow it felt more valuable than anything the restaurant had served all night. He took one bite, then another, and for the first time in hours his hands stopped shaking. Through the cracked pantry door, he watched Claire slip back into the storm of dinner service without asking for thanks, without waiting to be noticed, already balancing 2 dessert menus in one hand, while guiding an elderly couple around a crowded corner with the other. She moved fast, but never carelessly. She smiled, but never falsely. And the strangest part was that she looked tired in a way Ethan recognized. Not dramatic tired, not theatrical tired, but the quiet kind that settles into a person when every dollar has a job before it even reaches their account. By the time the rush eased after 10, Ethan had seen enough to understand that Clare Bennett was carrying more than trays. She checked her phone exactly twice all night, both times stepping into the service hallway with a crease between her brows before pasting calm back across her face and returning to the floor. Later, while polishing silverware near the server station, she asked the bartender if he knew of any place that rented medical lift chairs by the week. She asked it casually, as if she were discussing the weather, but Ethan caught the answer in her face before she buried it. Too expensive. He learned more by saying almost nothing at all. She was 26, lived in a 1-bedroom apartment in Astoria with her father, and picked up double shifts because the physical therapy insurance would not fully cover had not been fully approved. She had started community college classes in hospitality management, then paused them when her father got sick. She never called herself unlucky, never complained, never asked anyone to rescue her. When a busboy dropped a tray of forks near midnight and stood there looking panicked, Claire knelt beside him in her black flats and helped gather every last one, whispering something that made the kid laugh in relief. When the dishwasher said he was short on subway fare, she folded a few bills into his hand like it was nothing. When Vanessa blamed the kitchen for a delayed order that had actually been entered wrong at the host's stand, Claire took the heat quietly to keep the line from getting yelled at. Ethan had spent years believing service could be measured in ratings, margins, and reservation demand. But standing there in a borrowed vest, watching Claire hold together a room that did not deserve how hard she worked, he began to suspect the real backbone of Halston Table had never been the menu, the investors, or even his name. It was people like her, the ones keeping Grace alive in places that had forgotten how to value it. The next evening, Ethan came in an hour early and asked to be assigned to the West dining room, the section Claire usually floated through whenever someone needed help. He told himself it was strategy, that a good owner should study his strongest employee at close range, but the truth sat heavier than that. He wanted to understand how a woman carrying so much could still move through a room as if kindness cost her nothing. By 6:30, Halston Table was glowing again, polished brass, candlelight, expensive perfume in the air, the soft clink of silver against china. Claire tied on her apron at the service station, checked the seating chart, then opened her phone for 3 seconds before locking it with a quiet exhale. Ethan caught a glimpse of the screen this time, a text from someone named Dad that read, "Do not spend money on me. Get sleep." Claire smiled at it, but it was the kind of smile that had effort in it. She slipped the phone away and went straight to work. During the first wave of tables, Ethan watched her smooth over every rough edge in the room. A couple celebrating their anniversary complained that their table was too close to the piano, and Claire had them laughing before they even finished the sentence. A businessman snapped because his cocktail had too much ice, and she replaced it without letting him feel powerful for being rude. Then, just after 7, an older man at table 12 fumbled with his wallet and looked embarrassed when his hands would not cooperate. Claire crouched beside him, spoke quietly enough to protect his dignity, and waited until he was ready without rushing him once. Ethan saw the daughter at that table mouth "thank you" as Claire walked away, and Claire only nodded like it was nothing. Later, in the narrow hallway by dry storage, Ethan heard Vanessa corner her over next week's schedule. "You are asking for another afternoon off?" Vanessa said, her tone sharp enough to cut through the kitchen noise. "Do you know how replaceable waitresses are in this city?" Claire kept her voice even. "My father has physical therapy on Tuesday. I only need 2 hours. I will stay late after." Vanessa laughed under her breath. "Your family problems are not my problem." Ethan felt his jaw tighten, but Claire did not break. "No," she said softly. "They are mine. That is why I am handling them." Vanessa walked off, irritated that she had not gotten a reaction, and Claire stood still for 1 second, hand pressed to the order pad in her apron pocket, before returning to the floor. Much later, after the last entree left the kitchen, Ethan found a folded napkin beside the staff coffee urn with his borrowed name written across it in blue ink. Inside were 2 dinner rolls and a note in the same neat handwriting. "Eat first. Pride later." He stared at those 4 words for a long moment, then slipped the napkin into his pocket with a care that felt strangely personal, as if he already knew this was not the kind of thing a man forgot. By the 4th night, Ethan no longer needed an excuse to watch Claire. He knew the rhythm of her steps now, the way she moved faster when the kitchen printer began spitting tickets too quickly, the way she touched the edge of a table before speaking to a nervous guest, as if grounding herself in something solid before giving comfort to someone else. Halston Table was busier than usual that evening because a food critic was rumored to be somewhere in the dining room, and the pressure rolled through the restaurant like invisible heat. Servers straightened their shoulders, bartenders polished glasses twice, and Vanessa prowled the floor with a smile that never reached her eyes. In the middle of all that strain, Claire somehow made the room feel human. When the hostess started to panic over a party of 8 arriving 20 minutes early, Claire stepped in, grabbed extra menus, and said, "I have it," with such calm certainty that everyone around her seemed to breathe again. When one of the line cooks burned his wrist on a hot pan and tried to hide it so he would not be sent home without hours, Claire brought him a wrapped ice pack and quietly covered his expo station for 3 minutes while no one was looking. When an exhausted dishwasher admitted he had been up since 5 in the morning working another job in Queens, Claire slipped half of her sandwich from break into his hand and told him not to argue because she was not in the mood to be noble tonight. Ethan noticed that every act of hers was quick, almost secretive, as if she believed kindness counted more when no one could turn it into a performance. Near the end of the dinner rush, he finally ended up beside her at the back service counter while they waited on 2 chocolate soufflés that needed another minute in the oven. For the first time all week, there was no shouting, no clatter close enough to interrupt them, only the low kitchen hum and the smell of sugar and espresso in the air. Claire leaned one hip against the stainless steel counter and rubbed the base of her thumb like it ached. "You always look surprised when somebody is decent," she said without looking at him. Ethan glanced over. "Do I?" "A little," she said, "like you were still deciding whether to trust it." He almost smiled. "Maybe I am." Claire nodded as if that made perfect sense. This city does that to people. Then she looked toward the dining room, where a couple in designer coats were waving impatiently for service, and added, "Still, I do not think being tired gives anybody permission to become cruel." The words landed harder than she knew. Ethan had built Halston Table to honor his mother, to create a place where hospitality meant warmth, not theater. Somewhere between expansion, investors, and polished branding, he had let the idea drift into something impressive but hollow. Standing 2 feet from Claire Bennett in the glow of the dessert station, Ethan realized she understood the soul of his restaurant better than the man who owned it, and that truth unsettled him almost as much as it moved him. The discovery came on a Wednesday, the kind of gray New York evening when the city looked washed in steel and tired light, and Halston Table filled slowly with the after-work crowd, men loosening ties, women setting phones face down beside cocktail glasses, everyone hungry for comfort they would never admit they needed. Ethan had started the shift in the private dining corridor, where invoices, wine deliveries, and catering folders passed through management before anyone on the floor ever saw them, and that was where he noticed the pattern first. 2 servers were whispering over their pay stubs near the linen closet, voices low but strained. One said her tips had come up short again. The other said the same thing had happened last week. Only Vanessa had blamed a system error and told everyone to stop asking questions if they wanted good sections on Friday nights. Ethan said nothing, but every instinct in him sharpened. By 7 o'clock he was back on the floor, carrying appetizer plates and watching more closely than ever. Claire was in motion from the second she clocked in, steady as always, but there was something different in her face that night, a distracted tension just beneath the calm. During pre-shift, Vanessa had announced a new performance metric, claiming guest feedback cards would now determine preferred schedules, private event shifts, and tip pool waiting for support staff. The room had gone still when she said it, because everyone understood what that really meant. One person controlling the cards could decide who paid rent on time and who did not. Claire had not argued in front of the team, but Ethan saw the look she exchanged with the bartender, the quick flash of concern that passes between people who already know something is wrong. An hour later, while Ethan was refilling water in the West Room, he saw Claire kneel near the host's stand to retrieve a pen that had rolled under the cabinet. When she stood, she had a folded stack of comment cards in one hand, and for a split-second surprise crossed her face before she smoothed it away. Vanessa appeared almost instantly, too quickly to be coincidence, and held out her hand. "Those are management materials," she said. Claire did not move. "These are marked before the guests even fill them out," she replied quietly. Ethan was close enough to hear every word. Vanessa smiled, but it was the kind of smile that made the air colder. "You are a waitress, Claire. I suggest you worry about water glasses and let me worry about data." Claire handed over the cards, but not before Ethan caught the red check marks already placed beside names of favored employees and the blank spaces left under others. A few minutes later, in the service alley behind the bar, Claire cornered the bartender and spoke in a whisper that was still urgent enough for Ethan to piece together as he passed with a tray. "It is not just the cards," she said. "The tip envelopes do not match the reports. I checked Marco's side work log against the payout sheet. Hours are missing." The bartender looked alarmed. "Do not say that out loud." Claire pressed a hand to her forehead. I am not trying to start trouble. I just do not want people getting robbed because they are too exhausted to double-check math after midnight. Ethan kept walking, but every word lodged in him. This was no longer about one cruel manager humiliating tired employees. Vanessa was shaping the entire floor by fear, skimming from people too overworked to fight back, then using schedules and guest scores like a leash. And now Claire, with her impossible habit of telling the truth even when it cost her, had stepped too close to the center of it. Near the end of the shift, Ethan found her in the back hallway by the employee lockers, rubbing her temples while balancing her order book against her knee. You should go home, he said quietly. Claire let out a tired breath that was almost a laugh. I would love to, but apparently honesty does not come with paid time off. Then she looked at him, really looked at him, and her voice softened. Be careful around Vanessa. She likes people better when they stay small. Ethan held her gaze for one long second, the folded napkin with eat first. Pride later still tucked safely in his locker, and for the first time since he put on that borrowed vest, the choice in front of him stopped feeling like an experiment. Claire Bennett was in danger of being crushed by the very system he had allowed to grow under his name, and Ethan knew he was running out of time to decide whether he was still pretending to be powerless, or whether he was finally ready to become the man his mother had hoped he would be. The next afternoon, Ethan arrived before anyone else and unlocked the small office above the wine room with the key he had not touched in nearly 3 weeks. He sat at the desk in silence, still wearing the plain black coat of a floor server, and pulled up payroll reports, scheduling logs, and archived guest comment cards from the past 3 months. What had felt like suspicion the night before hardened into proof within 20 minutes. Support staff hours had been trimmed after close without explanation. Tip distribution totals did not match the nightly receipts. Preferred shifts kept circling back to the same 3 employees Vanessa favored, while the people doing the hardest work were being pushed into the weakest sections and the latest hours. Ethan printed everything, slipped the pages into a plain folder, and locked them away again. He was not ready to reveal himself yet. Not until he knew how far the damage went, and not until Claire was protected from the moment the truth surfaced. By the time pre-shift began, he had already made one quiet change. Claire's Tuesday dinner shift had disappeared from the board, replaced with a later start time and a note that simply read approved. When she saw it, she frowned and looked around the room as if she expected a mistake to confess itself. Vanessa noticed too, but assumed the change had come from corporate scheduling, and that small confusion pleased Ethan more than it should have. Claire worked the early half of the evening lighter than usual, and though she still moved with that same disciplined focus, something in her face had softened. At 6:45, Ethan passed her near the service station, and she stopped him with a touch on his sleeve. Did you hear who changed my shift? She asked. Ethan kept his voice neutral. No, but it looks like good news. Claire glanced toward the front doors, then back at him. My father had physical therapy this afternoon. I thought I was going to miss it again. She let out a breath that sounded almost disbelieving. He walked 6 more steps today than he did last week. For a second, the entire polished restaurant seemed to fall away, and Ethan saw only the pride in her eyes, the careful kind that comes from victories so small the world would miss them if nobody said them out loud. That is a big deal, he said. Claire smiled then, tired but real. It is to us. The night rolled on, busy but manageable, and for once Vanessa stayed buried in the office dealing with vendor calls, which gave the floor room to breathe. Close to 10:30, after the last entree had cleared and the room had thinned to a few slow coffee drinkers, Claire found Ethan on the back steps behind the kitchen, where the alley smelled faintly of rain, bread, and the city cooling down after a long day. She held a paper tray of fries and a small cup of garlic aioli lifted from staff meal. I am too tired to eat alone, she said, sitting one step below him. Ethan accepted the tray, and they shared it in the amber light above the service door, shoulders almost touching, the noise of Manhattan reduced to distant tires on wet pavement and the occasional siren blocks away. For a while neither of them said much. Then Claire looked out at the alley and said, Fine dining means nothing if the people serving it are starving. Ethan turned to her slowly. She did not say it like a speech, only as a fact she had lived long enough to trust. Hungry people can still smile, she went on, dipping one fry into the sauce. But after a while, You can feel the emptiness in a place. Guests can too. They just do not always know what they are feeling. Ethan thought of his mother in their old apartment kitchen, stretching soup for 2 nights, telling him that hospitality was never about impressing people, only about making them feel less alone. He looked at Claire, at the woman who had fed him twice without expecting anything in return, and knew with a clarity that unsettled him that this was no longer just about exposing Vanessa. Claire Bennett was reminding him why he built Halston Table in the first place, and somewhere between the shared fries, the rain-damp air, and the warmth of her voice in the dark, Ethan realized the role he was playing had started to cost him more than secrecy. It was costing him the truth. 2 nights later, Halston Table hosted one of its most important dinners of the season, a private event for investors, hospitality writers, and a handful of old money patrons who liked to be seen in rooms where everyone else lowered their voices. The dining room glowed like a photograph, candlelight reflecting off crystal, white orchids arranged down the center of the long table, servers moving in black and white like clockwork around plates that looked almost too beautiful to touch. Ethan had known all week that Vanessa would choose this night to tighten her grip, because people like her always preferred an audience when they wanted to make fear look like order. Claire was assigned to the main room, even though she should have been on an easier section after covering an extra lunch shift, and Ethan could see the fatigue in the set of her shoulders before service even began. Still, she never let it reach her face. She welcomed guests by name, adjusted place settings with quick, graceful hands, remembered dietary notes without checking a list, and made the room feel steadier than it was. Halfway through the second course, a woman in a pale silk jacket touched her wrist and suddenly stiffened. Her diamond watch was gone. The conversation around the table thinned at once. Vanessa appeared so quickly it felt rehearsed. She asked sharp questions with a polished smile, then announced that all floor staff would need to be checked immediately for the comfort of the guests. Claire stood very still near the end of the table, tray balanced in one hand, while eyes slid toward the servers one by one. Ethan felt something cold move through him. He had already seen enough of Vanessa to know she did not rely on chance. In the service hallway, away from the guests but not far enough to spare anyone the shame of it, Vanessa ordered aprons and pockets emptied onto the stainless steel counter. Pens, order pads, lip balm, receipt books, a subway card, loose cash for cab fare, all the private little objects of people who worked too hard for too little spilled out under harsh overhead light. Claire said nothing while the others complied, only folded her hands and waited her turn. Then Vanessa reached into the front pocket of Claire's apron and pulled out the missing watch. For 1 second, the whole hallway went silent. Claire stared at it as though it belonged to another universe. "No," she said, and Ethan had never heard her voice sound so stripped bare. "That was not there." Vanessa lifted her chin, already savoring the moment. "It was in your pocket. Someone put it there." Claire looked around at the faces watching her, humiliated but still upright. "I did not take anything." Vanessa told the bartender to call security. One of the newer servers began to cry quietly. Marco from the dish pit muttered that this was impossible. Ethan took 1 step forward, then stopped himself by force. Not because Claire deserved another second of this, but because if he moved too early, Vanessa would bury the truth inside confusion and outrage, and maybe walk away clean. Claire drew a slow breath and looked directly at Vanessa. "Do not drag the kitchen into this," she said. "Do not punish anyone else because you need someone to blame." Even then, even with her own job collapsing in front of her, she was still trying to shield other people. That was the moment Ethan understood there was nothing left to test, nothing left to confirm, nothing left to learn by hiding in plain sight. Vanessa had not just skimmed wages or manipulated schedules. She had chosen the kindest person in the building and tried to break her in the most public way possible. Ethan turned, walked past the lockers, past the back stairs, and straight toward the private office above the wine room, where a locked drawer held payroll records, marked comment cards, and the master access for every security camera in the building. By the time he reached for the key, his hands were steady. The waiter was finished. The owner was about to walk back downstairs. When Ethan stepped back onto the floor, the entire energy of Halston Table had changed. The soft jazz still drifted through the speakers, candles still burned low on the investor table, and servers still stood frozen in the service hallway with pockets turned out under fluorescent light. but the illusion of elegance had cracked. Claire was near the counter, pale but composed, her chin lifted even as humiliation tried to drag it down, while Vanessa held the diamond watch between two fingers like a trophy. Security had not arrived yet. The guests in the main dining room had begun to sense that something was wrong, their voices lowered to curious murmurs, and that was exactly when Ethan walked straight past the hallway, into the center of the room, and toward the microphone stand used for private toasts. One of the investors frowned as the waiter they barely noticed reached for the microphone, but before anyone could object, Ethan turned, and his voice cut through the restaurant with a calm that made the whole room go still. "My name is Ethan Cole," he said, each word landing with quiet precision. "I am the owner of Halston Table." The silence that followed was so complete, it almost sounded like the room had stopped breathing. Vanessa's face lost all color at once. Claire did not move at all. She only stared at him as if the floor had disappeared beneath her, and she was still deciding whether she was falling or waking up. Ethan set a plain folder on the nearest table, then looked at the guests, the staff, and finally Vanessa. "For the past 3 weeks, I have worked in this restaurant as a waiter because I wanted to understand what my employees experienced when no one important was watching. Tonight, I learned I should have done that much sooner." He nodded toward the bar, where the general counsel for his restaurant group had just entered with the head of security and a slim woman from corporate payroll. He had called them from upstairs less than 10 minutes earlier. Before anyone says another word about Claire Bennett, Ethan continued, "We are going to look at the facts." He handed a tablet to the head of security, who connected it to the private dining room screen normally used for wine presentations. A grainy hallway camera image appeared above the orchids and candlelight. The timestamp showed 12 minutes earlier. Guests twisted in their seats to watch. Staff stepped closer despite themselves. In the footage, Claire was carrying a tray toward the investor room. Vanessa moved past her, paused, then brushed one hand against the front pocket of Claire's apron before continuing on without turning around. A second video angle showed the same moment from near the host's stand, clearer this time, undeniable. The watch had never been Claire's. It had been planted. A shocked murmur rolled through the room. The woman who had reported the missing watch covered her mouth. Claire looked from the screen to Vanessa with stunned disbelief, then back to Ethan as if her mind could not catch up with the speed of what was happening. Ethan did not raise his voice. He did not need to. "That is only part of it," he said. He opened the folder and began laying pages across the linen tablecloth like evidence in a courtroom. Payroll summaries, shift reports, tip distribution sheets, guest comment cards pre-marked before service. For months, employee hours were altered after close. Tip allocations were reduced without explanation. Guest feedback was manipulated to control schedules and punish staff. The people working hardest in this building were treated as disposable under my own roof, and that ends tonight. Vanessa finally found her voice. She tried to say this was a misunderstanding, then an accounting issue, then a smear, but each excuse fell apart before it left her mouth. The corporate payroll director stepped forward and confirmed the discrepancies in front of everyone. The head of security asked Vanessa for her building credentials. She handed them over with trembling fingers. Ethan looked at her steadily. "You are terminated effective immediately." Then he turned to Claire, and the hardness in his expression gave way to something gentler, something almost painful in its honesty. "Claire Bennett, you are cleared of every accusation. You were telling the truth." He faced the room one last time. "And from this moment on, no one in my restaurant will ever be humiliated for being poor, overworked, or powerless again." The sentence hung there like a promise stronger than the chandeliers, stronger than the money in the room, and for the first time all night, the people who had spent weeks swallowing their exhaustion began to look up. The restaurant did not return to normal that night, because some moments are too honest to let a place remain what it was before. After the investors left in stunned silence and the staff gathered near the service station in a hush that felt half disbelief and half relief, Ethan made sure every server, busser, dishwasher, and line cook was paid for the full shift before anyone went home. He stood beside the payroll director until corrected tip totals were printed, signed emergency reimbursement approvals on the spot, and told the kitchen to box up every untouched dessert and family meal left in the back so no one would leave hungry again. Claire tried to slip quietly toward the lockers once the noise settled, but Ethan caught up to her near the back hallway, where the bright service lights softened the exhaustion in her face without hiding it. For a second, neither of them spoke. She looked at him, really looked at him, at the man in the plain black vest who was not a waiter at all, and then she gave a small, shaky laugh that held no humor, only amazement. "You could have told me," she said. Ethan nodded once. "I know." Claire folded her arms, not angry so much as overwhelmed. "I gave the owner of this restaurant cold fries in an alley. They were excellent fries," he said, and that finally pulled a real smile from her, brief but bright enough to change the whole feeling of the hallway. He grew serious again. "Claire, I am sorry. Not only for tonight. For all the nights before it. I built this place to honor someone who believed food should make people feel cared for. And somewhere along the way, I let it become a place that looked beautiful while good people were being worn down inside it." Claire searched his face, as if deciding whether wealth had made him better at speeches or whether this was the truth. "You came back," she said at last. "That counts." Ethan did not answer right away. Instead, he led her through the silent kitchen, past the cooling ovens and polished prep counters, to a narrow door at the far end of the corridor that most staff assumed was storage. He unlocked it and flicked on the light. Inside was a small original kitchen preserved from the restaurant's first year, before the expansion, before the investors, before Halston Table became fashionable. The room was simple, warm, almost modest, with an old butcher block counter, a worn blue mixer, handwritten recipe cards in a frame, and a black and white photograph of Ethan's mother smiling in an apron dusted with flour. Claire stepped in slowly, as if entering a chapel. Ethan crossed to the counter and lifted a small glass frame from beside the mixer. Inside, pressed perfectly flat, was the white napkin she had tucked beside the coffee urn. Her blue handwriting stared back at her in 4 plain words: "Eat first. Pride later." Claire looked from the napkin to Ethan, stunned all over again. "You kept it." "I needed to," he said quietly, "because those words reminded me who I was before money made everything quieter and farther away." He set the frame back down with care, then turned to her. "Tomorrow I am announcing a new employee relief fund, full payroll transparency, and guaranteed medical leave coordination for anyone caring for family. I am also reopening tuition support for staff who want to finish school." Claire blinked hard, emotion catching her off guard. Ethan continued, his voice steady, but softer now. "And if you are willing, I want you to help me build it. Not as a waitress people overlook. As director of guest experience and staff culture. You see things I missed. You protect people when it costs you. This place needs your kind of leadership more than another polished manager." Claire looked around the old kitchen again, at the photo, the recipe cards, the napkin, the room where the heart of the restaurant had survived waiting for someone to listen to it. When she looked back at Ethan, her eyes were shining but clear. "You are asking me to stay?" Ethan held her gaze, the truth between them finally free of disguise. "I am asking you to help me build a restaurant where kindness is never the weakest thing in the room." For one long, quiet second, the city beyond the walls seemed to fade. Then Claire smiled, slow and certain, like dawn arriving after a storm. "All right," she said. "But first, you are going to eat a real meal, Ethan Cole." And for the first time in years, standing in the little kitchen where everything true had begun, the millionaire who had hidden in plain sight laughed like a man who had finally found his way home.